समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Three things have inspired this episode of Cut the Clutter. Number one, the Prime Minister speaking at the Economic Times, one of their big events, where he said that his government is reforming all the time. It does not need any pressure or any urgency or any crisis. That was mainly to answer the likely criticism that the new wave of reform, which he says he's going to unleash, and which the Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal said the government will unveil over the next 100 days, that's being done under America's tariff pressure. So the Prime Minister made that statement saying that his government is always reforming. The second is this article that appeared in Business Standard. That's by Ajay Tyagi, who's a distinguished former IAS officer, also former chairman of SEBI, Securities and Exchange Board of India, now at ORF, Observer Research Foundation. This is headlined, as you can see, Government in Business, and he's basically flagging the fact that while the government and Prime Minister Modi himself promised that the government will get out of business, it has actually even reduced or stopped completely, more or less completely, the process of getting out of business or the process of disinvestment or privatization over time. I will share the data with you as we go along. And the third, that Lord Meghnad Desai, who passed away on 29th of July, he was a famous labor peer, not just a highly respected labor peer, but also an economist of many decades over generations. He had generations of students and generations of intellectual peers with whom he sparred, sometimes agreed. There was a memorial meeting held for him at the British High Commissioner's House, UK High Commissioner's House, where Montek Singh Ahluwalia spoke briefly, and Montek Singh Ahluwalia reminded the audience that in 1995, when Tony Blair, Labour Party, he moved away from what Montek reminded all of us was clause 4 of the Labour Party, of Labour Party's ideology. Then Lord Meghnad Desai supported him, which also means that Meghnad also moved away from that left positioning of the Labour Party. So it is these three things that have inspired today's episode of Cut the Clutter. What is the sum total of this? What are we getting at? So first of all, Ajay Tyagi raises the question as to why the government is not disinvesting, why the government is still in fact staying on with the public sector undertakings. The fact is, he's not saying it, I'm adding it. The Modi government, in fact, now is investing more and more in the public sector. In this year's budget, they have budgeted 5 trillion rupees, 5 lakh crores to be invested by way of fresh investments in the public sector. And he starts his column quoting from a webinar where the Prime Minister himself spoke on 24th of February 2021. That, you might remember, was the peak of that horrid Delta wave of COVID. That's when the Prime Minister spoke. I will quote from that also. And that's where he promised to get the government out of business. Since then, however, the government has gotten more into business. We are looking at that data and also explaining the phenomenon to you. So first of all, what is it that Labour moved away from, that Montek spoke about so glowingly by way of appreciating Meghnad Desai's support for Tony Blair for making that move away. But Montek also said in that short speech that the fact is that sadly, his expression, not mine, but shared by me, that sadly in India there seems to be total unanimity on support to the public sector across our political parties. Everybody supports the public sector. So I'm now adding it. Rahul Gandhi supports the public sector. Prime Minister Modi says public sector has never done better than under his watch. Everybody who comes to power thinks that there is no problem with the public sector. The problem was with the previous government. They can run the public sector better. They can run these businesses better. While the old philosophy, and that's the philosophy that I have found many people from the RSS, from the BJP, even Jansang days in the past have said, "Jis desh ka raja vyapari, uski praja bhikhari." That wherever the sovereign himself, the ruler himself, the emperor himself, or the government itself is in business, there the people are reduced to paupers. That's the exact philosophy, and yet the government has continued to double down on investing more in the public sector instead of disinvesting. Now, go back to where the labor started. The labor started in 1959 with something called the Clause 4. That Clause 4 is something that the Labour Party adopted in 1959 with Gerald Kaufman, one of the party's senior MPs later and also minister for some time. He later described as the longest suicide note in history. So what did Clause 4 say? Let me just read it out to you. Just 3 lines might give you the history of India's political economy and also the tragedy of India's political economy. So these 3 lines, this, by the way, this clause was drafted by Sidney and Beatrice Webb. They were leading members of the Fabian Society. Jawaharlal Nehru, as we know, was called a Fabian socialist. Much of Modi government's politics and policies actually anti-Nehru, and they blame Nehru for everything that's gone wrong with India. And yet there is an irony, which we have to note, that they're still following the philosophy and policy, at least on the public sector, that Nehru propounded, because Nehru was described as a Fabian socialist. So this was a Fabian society agenda. This clause, drafted originally by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the original members and founders of Fabian Society, in November 1917, right? That was the revolutionary era in Europe, because from the Soviet Union, these revolutionary winds were blowing at that time. And that's where Britain was very deeply influenced by that. That is where Nehru also drew his philosophical impulse from. So they wrote this para, which was then adopted in 1959 by the Labour Party. And this para read, I'm reading only an abridged part of it. It says, to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry and the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible upon the basis of the, and now underline, upon the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, and the best obtainable system of popular administration and control of each industry and service. This is, now you know where Nehru and later Indira came from, when they first of all licensed everything, so the private sector could not start anything without a license. Government got into everything. And second, wherever private enterprise existed, they started nationalizing it. If this was the longest suicide note in the history of Labour Party, that was the longest suicide note in the history of India's political economy. And sadly, that continues even now. Now, what happened in 1995? 1995, Tony Blair came and said, this is not right, because Labour had suffered, British economy had suffered, so he had it changed. In 1993, before he became leader of the Labour Party, Tony Blair wrote a pamphlet for the Fabian Society, where he criticized the wording of Clause 4, and he said, this does not clearly state the means and ends of the party. And he said, there is need now to redefine socialism because times have changed. Remember, this is post the end of Cold War. He said, time has come to redefine socialism in terms of a new bunch of values which were constant. Values can be constant while policies keep changing and evolving to take into account a changing society. Remember, that's the exact explanation that Narasimha Rao gave when I asked him that if he was a lifelong socialist, how could he make a U-turn on India's political economy without making it look like he was making a U-turn? Because he said in a country like India, you can never be seen to be making a U-turn. So he said something more profound, but I will simplify it just to say that what he meant was that suppose the ground under you is moving. I asked him, how does Narasimha Rao make a U-turn without anybody realizing he's making a U-turn? So he said, suppose, and I'm paraphrasing it, suppose the ground under your feet is moving. So that is what a politician does. A politician creates the environment where he can bring about change with the least possible resistance. That is something that Tony Blair is suggesting in this 1993 pamphlet. Then, at the conclusion of the 1994 Labour Conference, when he became the leader of the Labour Party, he proposed a new statement to replace this clause 4. This drew a lot of opposition, but he still won that debate in a special Labour conference on Easter in 1995. After a long debate, a new clause 4 emerged, and see the change in the reading and see the change in the wording. It says the Labour Party is a democratic socialist party. It believes that by the strength of our common endeavour, we achieve more than we achieve alone, right? So now it's endeavour, right? So as to create for each one of us the means to realize our own true potential. So there is no control of means and ends, right? Or means of production, etc. There is no control and there is no distribution. Each of us the means to realize our true potential, and for all of us a community in which power, wealth and opportunity are in the hands of the many, not the few, where the rights we enjoy reflect the duties we owe, and where we live together freely in spirit of solidarity, etc., etc. And then you can bring out your violin and play the music. This version of Clause 4, this version of updated Clause 4 appears on the back of Labour Party membership cards now. Now, the fact is that in India, Nehru came and departed. Indira came and made Indian socialism worse and then departed. Rajiv Gandhi played with it a little bit, made a few changes. When Indira Gandhi came back, she made a few changes. Narasimha Rao made sizable changes, and the Congress party has never forgiven him for that. Then, even under Deve Gowda and Gujral, even though short-term governments, a bunch of changes were made. But the basic philosophical shift from the Indian version of this Clause 4 was never made. The only leader who in a way made that shift was Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who said that government should get out of business, and that's when India saw the only substantive disinvestment or privatization in its history, when Arun Shourie privatized 11 companies and about a couple of dozen ITDC hotels, which were actually completely broke and broken. That happened in that time. Vajpayee did not win a fresh term, because if he had, maybe more of that would have happened. Since then, every government had made lip service to disinvestment. UPA did not even do that. In fact, the UPA, the first common minimum program, said there will be no privatization. And if you might remember, some of you might remember, as the election results had come out and it became evident that Vajpayee had lost and a new coalition will come in with the support of the left, A.B. Bardhan of the CPM was asked, so what will happen to privatization? And he said on TV cameras, bhaad mein gayi privatization. The fact is, since then, privatization more or less bhaad mein gayi hui hai. It's been in the dumps. So the only substantive privatization we've seen since then is Air India. That happened under Modi government's watch. Now, when the Modi government came in, there was a big expectation that Modi government will come in. It will be very pro-private business. It will get the government out of business. However, those who had seen the record of Narendra Modi, the chief minister in Gujarat for 3 terms, they always raised a caution by saying that in his state, he had not privatized any of his state-run companies. In fact, he was very keenly interested in the running of his government companies. So to think that he will come and start privatizing nationally owned, centrally owned public sector undertakings was maybe an exaggerated hope. However, when he spoke in 2021, then expectations rose that maybe he had now made up his mind and he was going to carry out a large-scale disinvestment. So I will share with you one story on the print written by late Ramya Nair, my colleague who unfortunately passed away. Also a story from the Hindu and a full note from Press Information Bureau, PIB, on the Prime Minister's talk in a webinar on 24th Feb 2021. Everything was on webinar those days because all of us were locked up. This was really the worst phase of COVID, the Delta wave. And he said there, and I will quote a few paras for you, He said that government has just no business to be in business. That's his line. Second, when a government engages in businesses, it leads to losses as the government is bound by rules and lack of courage to take bold commercial decisions. Then he goes on to say, the Prime Minister talking, it is government's duty to support enterprises and businesses, but it is not essential that it should own. And this seminar, or webinar, although I hate that word, this webinar, I swallow my pride. This webinar was organized by Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, or DPAM. In fact, the whole disinvestment business is carried on like that because it has changed names many times. It was Gowda's government, Chidambaram as finance minister, which set up the Disinvestment Commission. It was around that time that Rangarajan committee report came out. C. Rangarajan, the famous economist, former governor of RBI, chief economic advisor to the Prime Minister, and much more. In his report, he said that government can reduce its ownership, its shareholding to minority in non-strategic companies. Vajpayee then said that we have to sell a lot of our companies. You might remember that HPCL and BPCL, the two big oil marketing companies, were on the verge of being privatized when a judgment of the Supreme Court stopped it. And that judgment of the Supreme Court, which I rank amongst the 10 worst Supreme Court judgments for India's economy. I might do a national interest one of these days, listing at least top of the pops, at least 5 of the worst, but that's definitely among the top 10 worst, maybe among the top 5 worst, because that stopped all of Vajpayee's privatization. Because that judgment said that for any privatization, you have to go to Parliament and take a vote. That is why you might remember that when Modi government had to privatize Air India, they quietly slipped into the budget papers, into the budget bill, a line also about Air India's privatization. Now, the budget is a finance bill, so even if Rajya Sabha blocks it, it will still pass. It will be sent back and still pass. And that's why instead of risking going to Parliament with a separate bill for Air India's privatization, Modi government buried it into the budget documents, because who would dare to stop the budget? That is how difficult it's been to privatize in India. Once again, 2021, Modi government now, with its allies, has a 2/3 majority, because it was in that parliament that they carried out the constitutional amendment, which also changed the status of Delhi's governance. So if they wanted to, they could have done it. But after the promise, it wasn't done. I will quote further from the Prime Minister's talk that day. And I quote again, money from asset monetization and privatization will be used for social welfare schemes. It will be used to build houses for the poor, build schools, construct roads in villages, provide clean drinking water, etc. And then he says, every decision on privatization and monetization will help in empowering Indians. That was 24th of Feb 2021. What has happened since then? That is until now. No privatization has taken place. Even a quasi-privatization, which is the sale of IDBI Bank. How many times have we heard that this will happen in the next 3 months? That those next 3 months haven't come for several years now. And this year also looks like the financial year might pass without even IDBI Bank being privatized. So that's how averse this government has been to privatization after having promised it so enthusiastically. Now, what I will do is, in conclusion, I will share some data with you and some graphics. So there are these 3 graphics. Please look at these. So the first graphic, and I draw this data from Ajay Tyagi's article in Business Standard. First of all, see India's disinvestment targets or privatization targets that the Modi government has set up for each year from 2014-15, its first year in power, to 2023-24. Hello, you might say, why is 24-25 not there? I will tell you. And why is 25-26 not there? I will tell you. Now, 24-15, there was a target of 58,425 crores, of which about 40% was realized. Okay, first year. Second year, suddenly the target collapses. It becomes 25,312 crores, which is more or less achieved, but it's a very tiny target. Next year, the target is a bit higher, 45,000 crores, but nothing of ambition. It's mostly achieved, but that's mostly by way of small sales here and there, and in some cases, getting one company to buy another, one government company to buy another. That is like taking money out of one pocket and putting it in the other. I've used the example of Milo Minder Bender from Catch 22. It's a bit like that. Government buying its own assets and saying, I made some money. 2017-18 is when you can see the government getting really ambitious. But once again, it's a case of government companies buying government companies. Government has not given up anything. In this entire period, government has not given up any company other than Air India, which did not bring that much money because Air India had such liabilities. And then you see a collapse after that. 2017-18, 1 lakh crores, which was fully achieved, 1 trillion rupees, great. After that, you've seen a decline. And then you've come to a stage in 2023-24 when there is almost no target. And since then, the government has stopped giving any disinvestment targets in the budget. That's the reason I told you 24-25, 25-26, there is no target because government has stopped doing that, and government is now burying this under miscellaneous receipts. So it looks like government has given up the idea of any visible privatization. I would have expected that after that 2021 speech, this will change because that was an opportunity to change. But that did not happen. And now I would say, although the Prime Minister says that his government does not carry out any reform under pressure or in a crisis, but the fact is that if the idea is that use the next 100 days to do really bold reform, right? Because there is a real threat to India's economy from Donald Trump's sanctions, and God knows what else might come from him in the future. In any case, you don't particularly need a reason to reform. Also, given the fact that this government and the ideology that it follows so deeply dislikes Nehru and would prefer to do everything that is contrary to what Nehru had done or what Nehru has set as a principle in his time. Because their ideology runs totally in opposition to Nehru's. It's a supreme irony that on the PSUs, they have adopted or embraced the same Fabian socialist agenda that Labour Party adopted in 1959, dumped in 1995, and that the Congress Party adopted and then made it much, much, much worse. And that is something that even Modi government in its 11th year is not at least visibly making any departure from. And since we are talking ironies, I'll read out something for you, not in detail. I am sharing some screenshots with you. Please see these screenshots. This is a bunch of declassified American documents, US State Department documents. And this is a note from June 6, 1955 from Herbert Hoover Jr., son of President Herbert Hoover Jr., who's Under Secretary of State. And it's a note from him to the Exim Bank chairman then, saying that they've just had a presentation from JRD Tata and a team of Tata executives who want a loan of just about $90 million. And it recommends that US Exim Bank give this loan to the Tatas so that private sector in India could build more steel, because the Soviets at the same time have made an offer to fund steel industry in India in the public sector. That loan was sanctioned, and in fact, this note signed by Herbert Hoover says that this should be sanctioned now, and a press release should be issued before the Tata executives leave, so the press coverage in India does not become negative because of any misconceptions. A press release should be issued before the Tata executives leave. The fact is that loan was sanctioned. This was for expanding the capacity of TISCO, Tata Iron and Steel Company, now Tata Steel, by 7 lakh tons. The note also mentions that just as the Soviets made this offer to India to fund public sector steel making, BM Birla from the Birla Group was also in Washington seeking loans from the Americans to set up steel industry in the private sector. However, Tata's already had a steel plant. They got this money, they expanded their capacity, and the Soviets were not to be stopped, and Nehru was not to be stopped. So the Soviet offer was accepted by the Indian government too. And that's how in 1955, the foundation stone of the Bhilai steel plant was laid. So as you can see, the more things change, the more they remain the same. This event is from a time that was 2 years before even I was born, right? And just as at that point, Nehru government had its faith in the public sector, so now the Modi government has its faith in the same public sector.